Truth matters because we want to think carefully, logically about whether or not things are coherent and they make sense.
It's very important as people for us to have truth, but why?
People are saying, look, facts no longer persuade us, feelings do, and how do we even know what is true anyway, because everything is open to corruption in some way.
I was a very staunch absolutist for a time. Reason would reach its certain limit and then you would have a leap of faith, right, or a categorical leap. It's like, well, I can't justify this rationally.
If you have a post-truth world, what you're left with is a post-justice world. This is Miroslav Volf, and he says that a post-truth, post-justice world looks just like North Korea or Syria.
Hello and welcome to the Unbelievable podcast, where Christians and non-Christians come together to discuss the topics that matter to all of us. I'm your host, Ruth Jackson, and today we have an exciting live debate on the topic of truth, recorded at Aylesbury High School with the support of Aylesbury Vale Youth for Christ. Joining us today are Kristi Mair and Dr Shaun Stevenson, who will explore and challenge each other's views on the nature of truth. How can we know what's true in our post-truth world? Is there such a thing as absolute truth? And what does Christianity have to say about it? Kristi and Shaun debated some of these topics before inviting questions from our live audience of young people. Dr Shaun Stevenson is a lecturer in philosophy at Manchester Metropolitan University with a particular focus on the philosophy of death, which definitely promises to be a fascinating angle in our discussion today. Kristi Mair is a faculty member at Oak Hill Theological College and is currently completing her PhD in Philosophical Theology at the University of Birmingham. She's also the author of the book More Truth. Before we dive into today's discussion, I want to share what I'm going to call an exciting goal with you. We are aiming to double our subscribers. So if you enjoy debates like this one, please do hit the subscribe button. And if you're already a subscriber, then please would you consider sharing the podcast with your friends, because it really helps us to spread the word and to continue bringing you more engaging discussions like this one. Thank you so much. We so appreciate it. Now for today's show. The format will be in two parts. First, our debaters will tackle a series of topics, and then there's going to be this really exciting Q&A session with our young audience. To kick things off, I asked Kristi and Shaun to set the stage by defining what it means for us to live in a post-truth context.
So post-truth was a word that first came up in an essay in 1992, which was then later popularised and became the word of the year in 2016. And what that means is that facts no longer persuade in the public arena of ideas and conversation. Instead, it's about personal feelings that help us to understand what is true. So rather than thinking about facts as persuasive, instead it's a focus on truthiness. Like, does this feel like truthy to me? And so, you hear lots of phrases like, this is true for me, but it might not be true for you, or here's my truth, let me tell you, you can tell me yours. And really what it kind of boils down to is that in recent years, in the spike in kind of technological advances and progress, so many things have been doctored and manipulated in the public sphere, whether that's pictures or even recordings, that everyone's now kind of asking, well, how do we know what is true? So we're living in this kind of post-truth period of time where people are saying, look, facts no longer persuade us, feelings do, and how do we even know what is true anyway, because everything is open to corruption in some way. And so what that leads to is a great level of suspicion and cynicism around truth claims, particularly truth claims that kind of say, you know what, this isn't just true for me and true for you, this might actually be true for everyone. There's now a sense of, oh, you can't tell me that your truth applies to me because my truth is mine and yours is yours. So actually, this also leads to a sense in which truth, we're least able to define what truth is now, which means that even though we're more critical and suspicious of truth, we're not actually able to discern and judge truth well. We don't have the tools or the equipment to do that. So that just leads to kind of relativism and epistemology, which is just a big word for saying that you have relativist, true for me, true for you claims about how do we know stuff. And that also works its way out ethically as well. Well, people will say, well, this is morally okay for me, that's morally okay for you, because in a similar way, moral absolutes, moral values don't don't exist. So it works out in a number of different ways, but particularly in the public sphere, that's what it looks like.
That's really helpful, thank you. And we're going to talk a little bit about how, like, what are the practical applications of that if truth is your truth, my truth, things like that. But let's come to you, Shaun. I know you're not a relativist, but would you describe what relativism is? I mean, obviously, I know there's different versions of it, and then go on to say where you would perhaps land on this.
Kristi's already done a pretty good job, I think, to be honest. The idea behind relativism, it means that any truth claim is relative to a framework. So there's something that's built around the assertion that something is true. And that could be a whole host of different things. It could be that it's based around a particular period in time where something appears true at that time, but then later on we have a different framework that's developed and changed, and so it's not so true anymore, or not as appropriate. And it could be cultural as well, and this is quite a big thing at the moment, is cultural relativism, because it's very difficult to say, well, culturally this is wrong for me and for you, because cultures have had different origins, different developments, and again, that's just a different kind of framework. So when we talk about relativism generally, it's in relation to, well, whatever is true for you is true for you because of some framework that's from culture, social norms, and this kind of thing. What I'm more skewed towards, which is, I suppose it's almost, for some it would be just like a subgenre of relativism, would be perspectivism, which again is just a really fancy word. Basically, perspective, it's that as far as your personal experience is concerned, this is true, but then my experience is something different. And so then that opens up a different dialogue. And the difference mainly is in relativism is an external thing. This framework that's built around me is what informs my truth. Perspectivism is me and my personal experience, and that informs that truth. So it's kind of an external, internal thing.
And is that always the position that you've taken, or have you sort of changed your perspective on some of that?
Not at all. I was a very staunch absolutist for a time, where it was very clear that there were some things that were irrefutable, and that was in large part because of religious faith that I had a long time ago. And that meant that there were certain things that had to be taken as being the case, especially based on faith, where reason would reach its certain limit, and then you would have a leap of faith, right, or a categorical leap. It's like, well, I can't justify this rationally, but I know I need to accept it based on faith as being true. And in that case, it becomes something that can't really be challenged or attacked. And in a way, it's largely, again, it's a framework thing. Now I look back, it's very much, this is something that's I've been empowered to accept. It's also very exclusionary. I think that's a big part of the problem with anything that's to do with absolutism, is it means, well, this is true, and it doesn't matter what you think. And that's not very, that's a big part of why a lot of this discussion opens up, I think, because it becomes a question of tolerance. I don't tolerate that your truth is right. Actually, you're absolutely wrong. And where those boundaries and tolerances lie.
Again, I think tolerance is a really interesting area that we definitely want to chat about. But before we do that, just if you wouldn't mind defining a little bit about what you think on truth, and I guess going back even further as well, like, why does truth matter, do you think, Kristi?
Yeah, thank you. Well, let's answer that one first.
Yeah, sure.
I think it matters for two reasons. I think the first reason why truth matters is to do with the livability, and the second is to do with logic. So truth matters because we want to think carefully, logically about whether or not things are coherent and they make sense and they are internally consistent and they hold up and they hang together. And then secondly, you want to think, is this livable? So I completely agree with Shaun in thinking that, these absolutist claims that can be used to kind of control and to limit people can and has been very, very damaging. And I think actually demonstrates a false view of knowledge, of how I see kind of knowledge at work in us as human beings, in the way that we're made in the world, and we're able to engage with that, and also through revelation, through kind of scripture and how those things work together. So I think in terms of logic and livability, that's why truth matters, because I want truth to make sense, I want it to be consistent, and also I want to live a good life. So this is about the livability of truth that doesn't restrict me, but that actually opens me out into more kind of horizons of being. So that's a little bit about why it matters. So I think in terms of where I sit on this spectrum, I'm quite careful in some ways not to assign too many labels or categories, because I think, if one says I'm a relativist, or if someone says I'm an absolutist, there are all sorts of philosophical problems that come up the minute you start identifying in any of those ways. And because I think that we live in God's world, I think there is truth in each one of those kind of categories. The difficulty is discerning what that is. But my position would very much be a non-contentious one, I think, which is that objective and subjective truths exist. It's not, I don't think, contested that in some ways we do make our own meanings. Of course we do, and we live out our own kind of individual truths. But I don't think that is to the detriment of saying that actually there are some overarching truth claims that are true for all people at all times and all places. And I think that is really important because of the question of justice. And so, if you have a post-truth world, what you're left with is a post-justice world. This is Miroslav Volf, who wrote this fantastic book on embrace and exclusion, a philosopher. And he says in a post-truth, post-justice world looks just like North Korea or Syria. And so this is why I think it's important that we have both, and that the relationship between the two is well explained. Otherwise, I think sadly, you come up, as it sounds like your experience is, Shaun, of those who are kind of saying, this is the only way, this is what truth looks like, yet they don't tell you or teach you how you come to know what truth is, other than, saying this is what you ought to believe. And you're like, well, why? I mean, that's part of my story as well, but that's just a little bit of where I'm coming from.
Do you mind just going into that a little bit more? Why does a post-truth world look like a post-truth?
Post-justice.
Post-justice world. Yeah, what's the correlation there?
Yeah, so if you're in a, as I mentioned earlier, if we're living in a post-truth society, what that means is that we're saying that it's only your feelings that are kind of determining the responses to particular things that happen. So, for example, look at the war in Ukraine. Now, say if my feeling is, actually, I think that I feel okay with what's going on there, then there's no justice at all that takes place for the many victims that are suffering and who are dying. And so this is kind of, I think, what Wolf is kind of moving towards, is saying that therefore is post-justice, because then how do you hold to account people who say, well, I feel like that isn't actually a bad thing to have happened. And yet, I think I would kind of suggest that because we live in a world in which moral values do exist, even if, say, Hitler had won World War II and had exterminated all the minorities and people groups that he wanted to, even if he had won and history had been rewritten in a particular way, I'd still say that was wrong. Like that isn't how we ought to be living, that ought not to have happened. And so I think that's what's kind of being articulated in post-truth leads to post-justice, because feelings don't lead you to be able to make determinations based on facts which rise above how you feel, but they aren't, what's the word? It doesn't negate your feelings either. Okay. So they are important in terms of theory of knowing, but in this particular articulation of Miroslav Volf's position, I think it's more saying that this is what it looks like in a post-justice world.
That's really helpful. I mean, we might go into that a little bit more. Shaun, in terms of either a relativist or from your perspective, can we be certain that anything is true, or is it all depending on what position you're looking at things?
That's a good one.
I know it's a tricky one, isn't it?
I think so. The issue with saying something is certainly true is it's a closed door. And a lot of the times we have to ask, well, why is that happening? So it's like interesting some of the language you used about carefulness, coherence. And this is where I think truth really plays an important role. You know, it's very important as people for us to have truth. But why? Well, because we want things to be safe. We want things to be coherent. We want things to make sense. That's another thing you said about making sense. And, that's just how we work. That's how our minds work. That's how our reason works, because we want to have some kind of semblance of order. I mean, we do that immediately with things like, space and time. Well, everything has to be in a time, and everything has to be in a space, because if it wasn't like that, we wouldn't be able to comprehend anything around us. So immediately, in the background, we've already got instances where truths are being introduced, right? The issue becomes when truth is then detached from those apparatus, okay, the stuff that's working to frame this world, the stuff that's working to manage the world and everything we're receiving from it, when it's seen as not being within us, but actually referring to something outside of us. That then becomes the carefulness. And I don't know, if I was to be blunt, it would be, sometimes it's not great to be careful. Sometimes it's not great to be comfortable. Sometimes it's important and arguably, really significant for our development to say, no, there is no objective truth. There isn't an objective truth. If there is an objective truth, it is within all of us. And if there is an objective truth that we all agree on, it's precisely because we've agreed on it. So we've given credence and power to that truth by doing that in kind of this unwritten rule. Does that mean that anything is, anything is permitted? Well, I think that's why I say it's important for our development, right? What do I mean by that? Like our development and our growth. I'm kind of an experimentalist. Now, that doesn't mean that it's no holds barred. What kinds of things are going to govern that then? Well, when we're talking about justice, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but underpinning justice is often a notion of good and evil somewhere in between, and that this is tied with an objective truth. Not a fan of those categories because they become problematic because of how they come from us. There's nothing good or evil in the world itself. It's as simple as that. The world just is. All of this stuff is kind of fabrications, constructions by us, again, because we want things to seem like, well, of course this is evil, because that's what gives coherence and meaning and safety in my world, is to know that we're all agreed this is evil, yes, and everyone goes, yes, it is. But again, even that can differ with people. Rather, what we can do is, in experimentalism, focus on what's good and bad. Well, what makes something good or bad? Well, our interactions with stuff in the world is what makes stuff good and bad. If I have a good response to something, well, yeah, I'm going to want more of that thing. If I have a bad response to something, well, no, that needs to be diminished, in my life at very least, but likely in a lot of other people's lives. And so we can have a common understanding, a common notion that that's not a good thing and we should probably stop that. And we are all social creatures. We don't want these things, but we don't want them because out there in the world we've discovered that they're bad. It's that through our interactions with the world, we've learned about the badness of those things. There's nothing out there that I could go and uncover, like, pulling away a rock and finding underneath, there's the truth that, everything happening in Ukraine is evil. I can see it's bad by virtue of the, catastrophic destruction and everything that's happening and the effects it's having on people, how it is affecting them, the fact that they're so miserable, that it is so destructive. It doesn't benefit very many people. It will benefit a few. And for them, it's a perfectly good thing. It's not evil at all, which again casts into doubt whether that's a suitable barometer for something being, worthy of being considered true. Rather, what are the relations there? Well, yeah, it's good for you, but there's actually a considerable number of people who are suffering here. So it becomes a much more pragmatic thing in that regard. So that's why I say, I'm a bit of an experimentalist in that it's important that we have a freedom to explore those things, to not allow for certain truths to close doors, but to go and do these. Now, it doesn't mean that you do something that's you already know is a bad relation, all right, or you already know is going to have a bad outcome. It's not saying like, well, if you want to experiment with being a murderer, just, open that door and out you go, see what it's like. Because there is a destructive element in that interaction. And you know that without doing it, because it's been something that you have heard about, something you learn about. We mentioned about the Second World War and that awful genocide. We don't need to go through another one to go, actually, maybe, we should knock this on the head. It is pretty bad. We know that it has bad effects. We knew that before that whole thing happened. So I think, there is this thing where we need to be careful about notions of good and evil and how they're tied in with justice, rather focusing more on good and bad relations with things, finding out what the effects are of certain things, and then determining that actually the outcome of that, the consequence of that, is dire, is great, and so we'll reject or we'll pursue it for those reasons. And you don't need truth for that. What truth ends up doing is it does categorize things and it does end up becoming limiting. And that's not truth's fault, like it's a thing that could walk in the room and say, hey, that's not fair. But it's just our projection of an internal need that we have to bring a coherence to the world. I think that's
great.
Pretty much what I'm at.
Thanks,
I feel like that's it. I'm going to get...
No, I really want
so much there.
I really want you to respond to him. But I guess it just in light of what you were saying about Ukraine and some people viewing that as good, if objective truth or whatever aspect of truth you do think exists, externally does exist, then why is it not obvious to everyone? I guess even in the example of, say, the Christian worldview, there will be people that don't see eye to eye on everything, on a particular truth. So what would you say about that? And also, obviously, do respond to what Shaun was just saying there as well, Kristi.
Yeah, oh gosh, okay, there's so many things to kind of pick up. No, not at all. I think what Shaun is saying is so helpful on so many levels. I think I'd agree with Shaun. So in response to why isn't it more obvious, I think it is obvious. Like we all do each know internally what's good and what's bad. And that is obvious to us. And we don't even need to kill someone, as Shaun was saying, in order to know that that is a wrong thing to do. Like, we don't need to. And I agree that on the basis of experience, there are things that we're learning in the world that might be kind of things that I know for me might not be very wise. Like getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning for me is not always a wise thing to do because I know my body can't handle it. Whereas somebody else who's used to getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning, they think that is great. And you might assign a moral category to that on the basis of how I then go about living about my relationships that day, if it's better or worse, if it's more right or more wrong. I think, too, the other things that Shaun has picked up on and that he started talking about. So, there's so many things I want to ask you about, Shaun. So I think, firstly, you kind of mentioned that if we say that truth is certainty, if we're saying that this is certain truth, and I think I agree with you, so I don't think we can know anything certainly. I don't think that is something that is within the purview of a limited human being to be able to say, I know for certain that this is the case. And I would even radically apply that to my own Christian faith. But that doesn't mean that I don't think that there are good reasons to know that things are true, that there aren't good evidences or experiences. I think the other thing that I would just pick up is that mentioning that there isn't anything good or evil in the world, that's a really interesting thing to say. And I agree with you on the basis that classical theologians would say, if you've read them, or someone's smiling, would say that evil doesn't exist. Evil is non-being, like evil is a wound on the world. It's not something that is tangibly there in front of you that you can point at and say this is evil, because it's actually a marring, it's a privation of good that has been removed, and that is how we know that things ought not to be in particular ways. And so I think there are things then that it's not just our relationships that determine whether or not something is right or wrong, for the following reasons. I think firstly that leaves no room for moral revolutionaries. So if morality is on the basis of a collectivist view, of a group consensus, working out the framework or individually what that means, then what does that mean for people like Rosa Parks, who stands up on a bus and says, no, I'm not going to go along with this anymore, and actually changes through that one action the trajectory of history? Or Martin Luther King as well, who stands up and says, no, I have a dream, and my dream is that it does not look like this. So how do we account for moral revolutionaries within a collectivist group of morality who are actually calling the group to a different way of being? Similarly, I think we could say, well, what about moral guides? So how do we adjudicate between different nations who might be at war, or who might disagree with one another? What is the higher level to which we're calling them to account? If we're saying that the experiences of this group is that it's morally good, even praiseworthy, for warfare to take place, but the experiences of this group and perspective of this group is that it's not morally praiseworthy for these things to take place, who do you then bring in to adjudicate between these two nations to be able to determine what ought to happen in that situation? And also, we can be wrong. So this doesn't account either for human fallibility, that not everything that I believe, my opinions, are true. And if they aren't true, if my opinions actually turn out to be false, then I should discard those opinions. So there's lots there, but they're just three things that initially kind of come to mind. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Shaun. What are you thinking?
Well, I think the question of revolutionaries is pretty straightforward. In those instances, with both of the examples that you used, it's a case where an individual or a group of individuals are having their freedoms curtailed, right, by some other thing. In this case, it's a group of people, a very big majority of people, and laws even that have been set in place to restrict those freedoms. And so, again, it comes to that instance where I mentioned about, I suppose, with growth and development, leads into that notion of growth and development is about the increasing of one's power to act. It's the increasing of freedoms, right? So it's this Spinozist idea. Spinoza argued that what we all should do is try to increase our freedom, increase our power to act, and the way to do that is not to be burdened with superstitions or unhelpful, inadequate ideas. We can get rid of those, and we can understand how ourselves relates with the world and how to develop good relations and diminish bad relations, or at the very least understand the nature of those bad relations so that they aren't as bad. Then we can have a much clearer understanding of the way we can grow in our freedom. So in that, take Rosa Parks is a good example of, there is an external body, which is the person saying, get out the seat, that's my seat, you don't get to stay there. And I'm saying, well, this is actually infringing on my freedom as just, an agent in this world. And I'm not having it anymore, because I'm quite happy to stand up to this and take whatever the repercussions are. And as a result, a whole host of freedoms are improved. Not fully, but it's continuing. It's a process. And yeah, that idea of what we're trying to do, we're trying to ideally increase people's power to act, increase people's freedoms, and in doing so, we need to diminish those things which stop that from happening. And one of the things which stops that from happening is fixed ways of thinking. What we might call an image of thought, a structure of thought that we have. And someone that I'm a big fan of, Deleuze, he's very critical of what he calls a dogmatic image of thought, this overemphasis on common sense, on good sense, and the need to recognize that can actually be detrimental to our creativity. So once you say, well, something is objectively true, well, when I said it's a closed door, it means it's no longer a route for investigation. It's no longer a route for experimentation. We can't play around with that anymore. And I don't know, those things seem to change anyway. I feel like I'm going a bit off track. So as far as the case of revolutionaries, there's absolutely scope for that. Absolutely. And it's an important thing, and it wouldn't be possible without that kind of experimentalism and the willingness to go ahead and challenge those authorities. The question of conflict is a really difficult one. That's a really, really tough one, because I don't know, let's take the example of Germany. You mentioned Germany winning the war. It would have been great for Germany to win the war. It would have been really, really good for them to win. They would have done really well out of it, because I think of all the stuff they would have had, all the things that for them they would have accomplished that they were their goals, that to us were abhorrent in a lot of ways, and the huge devastation that would have wrought. And it wouldn't have been a possibility really for us to go, well, look, we're really sad about it, so if you could stop that, that would be great. And then go, well, actually, yeah, let's make sure that we help your freedoms with all this kind of thing. So, yeah, that's a tougher question. And I think it's kind of sad, but it's a part almost, unfortunately, it seems to be a part of human nature. I don't know why, that we insist on conflict. But this idea that, in order to have any kind of progression through history, there needs to be conflicts and then resolutions. There needs to be, side A, side B, and out of it we get society C. And there are instances where that, works for the benefit of everybody, doesn't work for everybody. And it always involves a lot of pain and suffering. But I think in large part, it can be fueled, again, to bring it back to truth, it can be fueled a lot by things like truth. If we take Germany, the truth of the Aryan race being superior, the truth of the need to spread those ideals around the world, the need to progress. That's all things which were really grounded in what was essentially propaganda. So you could very quickly say, well, that's not true. It was a very elaborate lie that everyone bought into. But that there is that issue of, well, this is a myth that everyone can buy into, and then they'll take that as truth. And that seems to be a recurring theme with truth, is it's whichever myth suits the people who need it at that time.
We're going to take a quick break. If you are enjoying the debate, we would love to hear from you. Drop us a comment if you're watching on YouTube. Tweet us on X @PremierUnbelievableFE, or send us a direct message on Instagram and Facebook @PremierUnbelievable. Your feedback and thoughts are so important to us. We will be back in just a moment.
Historians don't argue that something that happened only once in all of history is the most probable occurrence because somebody said it happened.
Unless there's an incredible evidence.
The incredible evidence is that Paul said
Not just
so?
that. Not just that. Where was the expectation of a Messiah rising again from the dead? Tell me that.
How many ancient Christian writings do we have by somebody who says in those writings that he saw Jesus? No,
this is my turn.
Let me finish.
Let me finish my point.
I'm answering your question.
You weren't answering the question.
You asked me my question,
Okay.
and
I'll
I'm
let you
answering
finish.
it.
All right,
Let's let Bob finish.
That was the exciting part when we arm wrestle.
Welcome back to the second part of today's Unbelievable show with Kristi Mair and Dr Shaun Stevenson. If you're listening on podcast, would you please consider rating and reviewing the show, as it helps others to find it. And if you enjoy the Unbelievable podcast, you may also like the C.S. Lewis podcast with Professor Alistair McGrath and Ask NT Wright Anything, which excitingly we have just released for the first time on YouTube. So do go and check it out. Let's get back to our live debate between Christian philosopher Kristi Mair and former Christian philosopher Dr Shaun Stevenson. They tackle a few more challenging topics before opening the floor to questions from our audience of young people.
How do we evaluate truth claims? Because clearly, in some senses, you would probably say that not all beliefs are valid. Hitler's beliefs are not valid in the way that Rosa Parks' beliefs were valid. So how do we evaluate those? And clearly some truths are dangerous or immoral, bad, if you want to put those categories on them. So Where would you go with that, Kristi?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things that I would do. I think firstly it's about the sources. Who are the sources? Are the sources reliable? Are there eyewitness accounts? Is there a great attestation to this? If we're thinking about documents, what are the manuscripts like? What are the sources? Who is the person? You're also thinking about the character of those persons who are sharing this information with you. Are they trustworthy? Are they reliable? Do they have a good record? Is this a repeated kind of evidence of truthfulness kind of in their lives or not? And I think this kind of, in a way, also just to kind of pick up on a couple of things that Shaun was just saying, and you've mentioned this a couple of times, how sometimes truth closes the door to investigation. And I don't know if you've come across, this is my field of study, is a guy called Michael Polanyi, and he's a former scientist turned philosopher. And one of the things that he felt really frustrated by was modernist claims that truth is a closed door, that as a scientist, he was taught, he went over to Russia for a bit and studied with Bukharin, and they were told that this is what you will find at the end of your scientific experiments. And Polanyi says, no, to be a good scientist, you cannot tell me what I'm going to find at the end of that investigation. And his kind of theory of knowing and truth leads to something which he calls indeterminate future manifestations. So what that means is when you've contacted truth, which exists independently to you, it's mind-independent reality, but you as a person have subjectively contacted truth, and there are lots of things that he says, that goes into how you do that and why, but you know that you have because it opens the door to indeterminate future manifestations. So these are things that you don't, at the time of making contact with it, know will be the repercussions and conclusions and outcomes of it. So for example, you discover X-rays and you have no idea that this might actually help you, or is it microwaves? I'm not a scientist, but when you discover something, oh yeah, there'll be future applications of this in technology in particular ways that you don't know when you've discovered it. And that opens the door to more investigation, and that is actually a marker of making contact with truth. And that, I think, carries on over into religious beliefs. So, thinking a little bit about the myths that we live by or that cultures kind of create. I completely agree. As you look at just vast swathes of history, you see particular people groups who create their own myths, to live by. And I'm not sure if Shaun, you're applying this to the Christian faith as well as another kind of myth. Are you, is that?
I don't know. That's a good question. I think that, with Christianity, it becomes another issue of this is how things are. This is the rules you should follow. I mean, arguably, in some instances, it's even worse than the original set of rules that were given to follow. Particularly if we were thinking about women, it can very often be even worse, Christianity, compared to the Hebrew scriptures that it originates from. But
Can you give me an example? What do you mean?
So if in the Old Testament, if you want to get a divorce and you're a woman, not a problem. It's not a problem if your husband's caught in adultery. Then that's fine. You can get a divorce, not a problem. Mosaic law is perfectly fine with that. But with Jesus' clarifications in the New Testament, it's only the man who can call for divorce. A woman can't. He doesn't state that a woman can get a divorce. A man can divorce a woman if she's found to be adulterous, but it's not the other way around.
Whereabouts in the New Testament are you getting that?
It's going to be in one of the Sermon on the Mounts.
So Jesus said that? That's interesting.
Yeah.
I think when I've read that in Matthew, for example, and I'm aware that I'm closer to these texts than you might be, but that Jesus says that we have allowed for divorce. Moses allowed for divorce due to hardness of heart, and so thinking about the topic of divorce and who is able to go for it. There are different schools at that time, different rabbinic schools. Like there was the Hillel and the Shiel school who had very tight rules. Like there was one that said that, you know, if a woman turns to be displeasing to you and no longer, you know, is attractive, divorce her. If she burns your breakfast, divorce her. And actually what we see in the New Testament is an opening of some of those restrictions, saying no, divorce is permissible. And I think it very much depends what your hermeneutics is in terms of how you're interpreting those particular texts. So in terms of the New Testament, the world in which it was written, it was revolutionary in the way in which the Jesus community related to women in society. Women were able to speak, pray, prophesy, fully engage in all of the activities of the local church. They were able to attend. They wore veils in order to protect them, rather than as a covering to restrict them in society. And it was very countercultural, the way in which women were treated at that time. But I can see you're disagreeing with me.
No,
Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, especially with Pauline Christianity, is really problematic. I don't know how Paul can say in one breath about how great, I can't remember the woman's name, is doing with her congregation in some place, and then in the same breath say, but all women shouldn't talk at church. Talk when you get home, when we can't hear you. That's where you're allowed to speak. And make sure I mean, it's interesting you say that they're covering themselves to protect themselves, because it seems a lot like it's a cover your hair because we don't need to see that kind of thing, and it needs to be, well, I mean, I don't know, just covering yourself up generally is a weird thing to compel other people to do. It seems really strange to me. So yeah, I think it's problematic. I think it's not that there aren't issues in Hebrew scripture, particularly with things like nidar, which is menstrual bleeding and all that kind of thing. But again, it's this thing of and to feed into the thing we were just talking about. You know, you're saying, you think about the sources, but again, it's going to a person. Or a scripture or a something that will then tell you this is what you need to do. And that's precisely the kind of thing that people like Rosa Parks were fighting against. It's like, well, you're telling me I have to do something. My government as a body is telling me I can't stay in this seat. Well, that's not going to work for me. So I'm going to butt up against that, and whatever the repercussions are. With the idea that I'm going to pursue what's going to make me freer, happier. But then an appeal to someone or something to tell me what I should believe or what I should do, or, you know, it's giving up a great amount of liberty. And it's not that we don't do that. It's not that I'm suggesting that no one ever does that, because we do, like I say, we are social animals. There are some things that we have to concede. But then we do that, going back to what I said before, because we know, is it good or is it bad? Like, that's our kind of our measuring stick. You know, what are the repercussions? What are the consequences? Is it going to make me a freer person? Is it going to help me to express my liberty? But in many instances, particularly within religion, it's, well, you know, even if you look at somebody and you think, I really hate that person, then you may as well have killed them. You know, it's like, so don't even think in a certain way. That can be really, really restrictive, I think.
Maybe we need to pick up on the hermeneutic. I feel like that could be a really interesting part too. Sorry, I feel like you were going to say something.
Oh, so many things. That's so good. Thank you so much, Shaun.
While we're talking about the biblical stuff, I think I'm sure there's so much you want to come back on with that. But there's that verse in John 14:6, I think it is, where Jesus says, "I'm the way, I'm the truth, and I'm the life." And I suppose someone like you would say that is potentially arrogant, intolerant, delusional. I mean, how would you respond to that? Is a claim like that just totally mad in a post-truth world?
Yeah, I would say that truth itself is not bigoted, but people are. So people can communicate things in a way which is arrogant, you know, which is what was the other word that you used?
Like delusional, intolerant.
Intolerant, yeah. That's you know, like small a, abusive, like that. That is possible. It is possible to use truth against people, and sadly, history in some ways has borne that out. But that doesn't mean that truth in and of itself is bigoted. It's the people who have communicated that in particular ways. And I think one of the things about that verse in particular that you've just mentioned, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Again, there's a theologian called Thomas Aquinas, and he, writing on the life of Jesus, says that Jesus in his life demonstrates the way of truth. And I think that brings together some of the things that we're looking at, that it's not here's an external truth thing which is being pronounced over me, which now in some way restricts me and my freedom. It's actually a call to follow Jesus along the way of truth so that we become more free in terms of even the example that Shaun used. I think that to become a more loving person, it's great not to look at people with hatred, because the bar is so high and hatred is so real and so destructive to my soul, that even to look on someone with hatred, in my heart, I have killed them because I hate them. And so I think it actually frees me to become a person, and I don't always do this very well, by the way. I'm not saying that I'm a paragon of virtue in any way whatsoever, but that pursuing the way of truth in Jesus frees me to become more like him in a Kristi-shaped way. And I think it's the beauty of those two things coming together.
Shaun, I feel like you're not convinced by that.
I would say just be Kristi in a Kristi way. Like, I don't see, it's almost injurious to yourself to need to mold your life to someone else. Is that Nietzschean phrase, be what you are. Just find the things that work for you, find the things that, and it might well be, you go, hate just doesn't work for me. It's just that's not it. But you could come to that conclusion without somebody telling you, oh, hey, this isn't a great thing to do.
But how, Shaun? Because earlier on you
through
said...
experimentalism. I hated that person. Where did it get me? Well, actually, I'm just sat here, they cut me off in traffic. I'm here fuming about it, thinking, what could I have done in that situation? How could I have got back at them? And then suddenly realize they could just be sat at home just enjoying a meal with their family, and they couldn't care less about what happened. But here I am seething with resentment. Well, this isn't doing anything for me. It's just causing me grief. So I'm just going to learn to let go of that. And the next time something like that happens, I know what the effect of that is. It just doesn't do anything for me. But then I don't need something else to come in and tell me that. There's lots of things that we do hear from people. You hear lots of lessons from parents and stuff, and we can take those on. But even in those cases, sometimes it's important to find out for yourself, make your own mistakes. That's what we often hear. But then the whole idea of making your own mistakes is that you're finding out about who you are and you're exploring that. And I know you might say, well, you can still make your own mistakes, and people do make their own mistakes, even if they are following a particular creed or a particular way of life. But I think there is a difference in that what I'm suggesting is spending time as someone in the world and exploring and finding out about the world by being within it, rather than appealing to something that's not of this world, that is, what we might term as transcendental, right? Or transcendent, something that's not a part of the world, something that's the opposite would perhaps be immanent, so something that's not immanently in the world that I can experience, but something that's purely rational. And that's where I think maybe quite a bit of the difference comes in, is that rather than focusing on the rational truths that, again, are all within me, they're all the kind of things that my reason wants, right? My reason is like, hey, I want this. I want to have something to follow. This is great. I've got these truths that I can apply to my life, and now my life seems to be getting better, is to allow for more immanent life within the world. So rather than, the reason I didn't get cross is because somebody told me not to, being like, I got cross, and where is that sitting with me? And it might be for some people, actually, it's really great that I get really mad, because then I take all my frustration out in kind of this seething resentment and this, rumination, and I get that out of my system in that way, rather than taking it on someone else. And I wouldn't have the capacity to separate myself from that. And you just, I don't know, gives you the opportunity to learn what your way is, what would be the Kristi way of doing it rather than the Christian Kristi.
Thank you. I think I love your optimism in me. And I think what you've described, as you should probably know, it's habit formation, but more than that, it's virtue ethics, essentially, that we become what we practice and what we kind of behold over a series of time. And again, I don't think we disagree on that, in that I'm not saying that I need Jesus, I only need Jesus in order for me to become a more moral human being. Like those, and I think it's the bringing together of the subjective, indwelled, embodied person that I am with transcendent truth, but that comes to me in a person of Jesus who's able to meet me where I am and powerfully shape me. But that isn't in any way a way of saying that I'm not present in that process of becoming. There is both being in God and becoming in me. And as God dwells in us individuals, those who like have that kind of faith by participation become better. But that is through exercising it. So again, it's not a zapping of suddenly here's transcendent truth and transcendent truth has immediately made me better. Because again, we could read the news, we could read any kind of book recently, particularly on Christian leadership, and just seeing like the narcissism in the church and how poorly Christian leaders have treated people. It's not enough to say, I believe in God, therefore I am a moral being in any way, shape or form. And I think what you're highlighting is often what sometimes has been overlooked, is the duty to self, in a way, to become by practice and habituation and this kind of virtue ethics approach to life, mindful of how we're actually behaving and interacting with one another. And that's really, really important.
If objective truth does exist, then how do we account for people perhaps like Shaun who have converted, deconverted, constructed, a religious conversion from one particular absolute truth which they held to then something else? Was it that was the truth, this is no longer the truth, or is it more of the relativist position, like it was true for that time, but now it's true for this time? I guess where does conversion and deconversion sort of come into all of this, Kristi, do you think?
Well, maybe Shaun could tell us more about that and his experiences, but through my own experience of having to look at my faith carefully and rationally, I see that sometimes what's common to some stories, and I don't know if this is true for you, Shaun, so I don't want to be speaking into your experiences anyway, but as you asked me, is I think, and this is what draws me to epistemology, is a faulty view of knowledge and a faulty kind of epistemological approach to some of these truth claims, where you're told this is the truth and this is it. You either agree or you go, right? Whereas I think what we see in terms of, and we see this in Scripture, and there are particular kind of philosophical schools as well that attest to this, is that knowing looks much more like knowing, unknowing, and new knowing. And so in all of our lives, as we kind of grow in our knowledge and understanding of things, there's things that we're going to cast off and we say, I no longer believe this to be true. Santa Claus, I hope that wasn't a spoiler. But, I think wonderful, this is a game. This is a game, we all know what the rules are. But there's a time in which you say, okay, you've unknown that, and then there's now a new knowing that takes place as a result of that. And this continues. There are things that I'm having to kind of either unlearn or I'm learning for the first time. So rather than viewing knowledge as you're building a house and you've got the bricks at the bottom and you're just building top by top, what often happens is, if that's the way we view knowledge, something will come along, and if it's something that attacks one of the bottom bricks, Jesus didn't rise from the dead. What about church abuse? What about personal suffering? What about reliability of scriptures? Then the whole thing can come just tumbling down on you. Whereas if we see that as, so there's a question here about historical reliability. I've been taught this, and actually this might not be right, but that doesn't mean that if this isn't true that I have to throw out everything with it. I need to now think carefully, how do I recalibrate? What is the new knowledge that I need to take on board in order to learn this better and preserve what is good? And often when we only have the one view of knowing, which is bricks ground up, that can actually lead to quite an unsteady structure overall. And rather viewing it as this kind of, it's this mutually informing, knowing, unknowing, new knowing kind of dance, I think that's a much healthier way that better accords to us as human beings and how we know. Sorry, I'm rambling so much. Please take over.
I think you've earned the rambling after I've gone on and on. You get to do it. I can understand that idea, that foundationalist view of, if everything is grounded on the understanding that Scripture is the Word of God, but then I find something that challenges that, like the decision of what books should go in, is just, discussion and voting. Well, this can go in, this isn't in. Whether or not you believe it was spiritually led. Then suddenly it becomes a thing of, well, hold on a minute, what makes everything else not legitimate? And there's a lot of questions around that. And then, I can see what you're saying, if that then becomes, the foundations crumble and everything comes down with it. I think a big part of the issue, as far as if we were to just talk about like my changes, were things where there is so much of, if we were to just focus, I suppose, on Christianity, there's so much of that does not serve me, or I would even argue most other people. There's some things which are valuable. Things like the care for others, compassion, mercy, love. Those things are valuable. They're valuable anyway, without the whole theological baggage. Again, by virtue of the effects we see of them, right? But then there's so many other things that you can or can't do, and it becomes very prohibitive. In that, there's like we said before, it's okay, so you got mad, but don't do it again. And what are the thing to think about as well is what the repercussions of those are. I don't know, just to get personal, I think, well, I'm on this journey to try and become the most Christ-like I can be, but my family couldn't care less. Then does that mean what? My family has to sit outside the gates of heaven and I just watch them all suffer for eternity? Well, I don't want that. Why would I want to be a part of that? That kind of punitive aspect of it. So what's that driving force? And I think that it can be easy to be like, well, it's just about being a better person, and about, making the most out of life. But there's so much of Christianity, there's kind of two things that are happening. There's so much about Christianity that is, well, if you don't do this, it's bad news for you, right? It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for rich people to get into heaven, so don't accrue riches. Whatever you do, don't do this. Whatever you do, don't do that. The chances are you're not going to go down the narrow path because you're going to fall foul of the love of God or whatever. You're going to do something wrong. It's an impossibly high bar to try to reach, right? Well, here's an example that you can live up to. The sinless person who never does anything wrong. Okay. Well, it's not really attainable. So it's not very fair. We're going to get all into eschatology now, aren't we? This is the problem. But the point is, it becomes very prohibitive. I mean, we even see that in the prohibitive nature of the Ten Commandments. And if we compare that, let's say, we were talking about humanists earlier, to the kind of humanist 10 principles to live by, none of those are prohibitive. There aren't kind of punishments against them. They're just things that we see as having positive impacts in the world. There doesn't need to be any repercussion. There doesn't need to be any external motivation for that. There doesn't need to be somebody to tell you that these are good things to do for you to do them, because you find out for yourself and you can see that the positivity that is at work in the world through these things. And that doesn't come from there being something out there that has been discovered. So like, the humanists have just discovered the truths that were already there waiting to be picked up on. And that's not me trying to reduce your point.
No, it's totally fine. Reduce away.
But it's that we, through practice, can see that those are things that are happening. And you mentioned about virtue ethics, and I want to jump on that. And I think, I don't have issues with virtues per se, but I do think that virtues, they will be different for different people, different strengths that people have. They can't necessarily be shared out completely equally. There are some things that I'll be very good at, that I can do, some things I'm very poor at doing, that you'll be far better, and that's a difference in us, within us. I don't think it's necessarily fair to be like, well, I just need to be more like this, that's completely out of who I am and be different to myself, and I have to mold or shape myself in a way that's not amenable to me or is even bad for me. I think that comes in with what I was saying before about, there's that external motivation side of things, and there's also it's the trying to form myself into something that's an expectation from without of me, rather than determining what within me is going to be most empowering for me.
I'm aware I really want to get to Q&A, but would you mind if you just ask, I guess, some of this stuff, it can feel quite up there, can't it? And we don't want this to be theoretical, we want it to impact our lives. So do you think our perception of truth impacts how we feel about meaning and purpose and the kind of practical outworkings of what we do day to day?
Yeah, I do. So again, this is where it's a wonderful conversation to have, because it helps us to think about some of the differences and the nuances when we're talking about truth. So Shaun has just mentioned, truth can be seen as prohibitive and punitive. And those are two big things to say. And I think in terms of how we view some of these big truth claims, if we're saying that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, then that what is tightly wedded to that is something called teleology, which is that there's a goal, there's an end point to things. So in terms of meaning, I don't deny that we create our personal meanings. I create my own meaning in different ways in the way in which I live my life. But that also, if Jesus is right when he says that he is the way, the truth, and the life, then that truth claim will also give a goal to the meaning of my life. And they are some of the things that are kind of picked up in just everyday life. And I think in terms of thinking about some of the values or virtues that Shaun's mentioned and saying that they are there, I don't think that that's necessarily self-evident, because then you have philosophers like Michael Ruse who say that ethics and moral values is illusory. It's just a product of evolutionary kind of processes, and to ascribe any deeper meaning to them is absurd. And so I think we have several kind of problems and options that open up to us. How do we view ethics? How are we grounding virtues and values of meaning and the good life? And I do think that personal small t truths exist and I create them, but that there are transcendent truths that exist that do give meaning to my life, and that give goals to one's life as well. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it totally does. Has anyone got a question? Okay, yeah, that's a great question. If objective truth does not exist, is that statement itself not objective?
Yeah, it is. And that's the inherent problem. But it's an inherent problem in the entanglement of kind of our reasoning. So you've highlighted a perfect issue with reason, in that there are the limitations of it, such that we can only really be working through problems, rather than assuming that there are solutions to these things, like there could be some solution to that. And I think, it highlights that the framework we are working with regards to truth is entirely representational, which is to say it's just going on in our minds, and our minds can get stuck in these kinds of loops because it's not a foolproof system. So therein, I suppose, lies the rub. And this is a particular problem with relativism as well, is that the claim itself falls foul of the thing that it is claiming. So it's like, well, you say that, but that's just on you. Actually, it is the case that these things are true. But again, I think that that's because of the kind of chains of representation that are wrapped around that discussion. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but the fact that these things happen demonstrates that they are internal structures that we're using to try and make sense, and that invites the opportunity for nonsensical things. And it's important to remember, I keep saying this, that it's going on in our heads, because in the world, the world is a vast irrational. There is no truth, there is no sense in the world. It's just all the projection of us on it. And it's, not necessarily helpful to say, well, it is something that I can discover, because then immediately issues arise with those kinds of things. How is it discovered? And we get into all sorts of muddy waters. But yeah, I don't know if that answered the question or not, but I tried. It's a really good question, thank you.
Anyone else got a question? Yeah, that's a great question. So what would the world look like if objective truth existed, I suppose, is also obvious compared to a post-truth society?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. In some ways, I think that's very difficult to imagine, because I think if everyone lived as though objective moral values existed, and if everyone lived as though there were particular, as though Jesus actually means it when he says that he's the way, the truth, and the life, then I think society would be completely revolutionized. And yet we haven't seen a world, a culture kind of do that. So in some ways, we're already living in the world that you've asked about. There are different societies and cultures who do believe that moral values, objective truth does exist. But then we have to ask, well, what kind of objective truth? And the question again around sources and around integrity, and what sort of life does this lead to? What is the God that is being revealed through kind of these claims is very important. And so I think we haven't yet seen a society where that has been consistently lived out, but there are different societies where objective truths are upheld. And, ours is one of them, really. You think about our justice system. There's some great work recently by Tom Holland and others who are greatly indebted to the heritage of Christianity upon the West, and thinking about human dignity, human values, human rights are all flowing from a basic kind of Christian principles. And so in some ways we're seeing the benefit of that, but not in all areas. Though I wouldn't want to advocate for that at all. But that is what it could look like a bit more.
That's a great question, thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah.
If objective truth does not exist, then why are you here debating whether it does?
Because I think, and I'll tie this into the last question as well, I think that objective truth is really dangerous. I think it's dangerous because it has too much power. Objective truth becomes almost irrefutable. If you say something's objectively true, it's immediately exclusionary of any kind of challenge. Can't be challenged in that way. Then you might say, oh, well, something might come about that will disprove it. But that can, again, be a great cause for violence, right? It's a violence on individual belief, it's violence within society. There's a great deal that's done to people's beliefs there. I mean, with the whole thing of, what would a society where objective truth is the thing look like? I think we see loads of instances where that's the case, and historically too. And it's one where there's a great deal of division, and the division comes from those who believe an objective truth is true and those who know that it's not. And the ones who know that it's not tend to be the ones who uphold that it is, and they make a lot of money and a lot of success out of it. And we see that all the time. And people who accept and take on objective truths, they become subjected to those truths. And I mean that in that term, they are subject to them. They become subjects. They are beholden to it. And it can be really limiting and really restrictive. And so that's why I think it's really good to try to debate this idea, because if we can accept that just there isn't a truth, right? That truth and falsehood, they exist, but they're kind of illusory. They're fantastical things that we need, And we absolutely adopt them in life, but we do so because of what's needed for us to understand the world. That's where it ends. Anything outside of that, there's no truth in the world, there's no falsehood in the world, no good, no evil. There's nothing like that, no reason. All of that is just us imposing, it's anthropomorphizing the world. Saying, well, of course the world reflects what it is to be a person, and that's how I know that there's truth in there. What happens then is, it kind of leads to a great deal of, I feel like it leads to a great deal of opportunities for control. You can end up controlling people in that way. Your truths are this is how you fit into these strata in society, here's who you are. And we've catalogued that, we've put that in the algorithm. And now we know exactly how to advertise to you, we know how to make money from you, we know how to extort information from you. And it's because you believe you are this person, because you believe that you fit into these categories. Now, the moment you can kind of break free of that, the moment you stop allowing yourself to be determined by external things, like the belief that there's an external truth that you should attach yourself to, and acknowledge that these things come from you, you become so much freer to then say, no, I'm not going to fall into those strata. I'm not going to fall into those categories. I'm going to allow myself to have that fluidity of movement, that opportunity to experiment. So I think that's what is worthwhile talking about objective truth for, is to try and open up people's opportunities for experiencing something that's very different for them. It might be very painful, but then all growth is. And I think that that's what it is about: creativity, growth, development, novelty. We need that, and that's very much butts heads, I think, with things like objective truths and truths that are out there that are really difficult to challenge.
I think we've got time for one more. That's a great question. What is the difference between facts and truth? Thank you.
Great question. Shall I start?
Go
and
for it.
then Shaun, you can get the grand hurrah at the end. Okay, so there are different definitions in terms of truth. So, and you can tell from our conversation that we have different understandings of what we mean by truth and what we even mean by kind of objective truths. Truth, as I understand it, is something which our knowledge of it fits the way things are. So Plato, for example, in Sophist, says that true statements are things that describe the way things are. And a false statement is something that describes something differently from the way that things are. So truth, in terms of truth, and Shaun would probably strongly disagree with this, but in terms of kind of like a theological kind of understanding of truth, that things are true if they measure up to the reason and purpose for which they have been made. And my knowledge of that is true if my knowledge reflects the way the thing is, if it fits what it is. So for example, I can tell you that my car is parked over, I actually don't know what the place is, but it's parked over in that direction somewhere near a Rococo lounge. And if you were to go over there and you were to see if my car was there, you'd know if I was telling the truth, because my statement reflects the reality that it's there. Facts are things that are true at all times and in all places. So in some ways, there isn't that much of a distinction between what is true and what is factual. But the way in which you come to know the two can be very different. But for example, like 2 + 2 = 4 is a fact. That is something that is known in all times and in all places. Whereas the relevance of me saying where my car is true, and it is a fact, but it's not necessarily relevant for all people in all times and places to know that my car is parked over there. I think that's how I understand it, but I'm not a scientist, so I don't know what a better construct would be of understanding what facts are.
Anything to add, Shaun?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. But just to reinforce the idea that especially with figures like Plato, this idea that things are true, Plato has this notion of them being true in a way that's, again, transcendental, which is to say it's something that's not of the world. So it just goes from, the world differs in greater degree from The idea thinks, I don't know, take the example of a leaf, and then all leaves share in the one true form of a leaf, but they all differ in slightly different ways, and that's fine. Whereas I would see it as the inversion, that actually we take what is entirely different and gradually build to there being a leaf and it fitting something, because we're imposing it on the world. There's an imposition of that truth, and it's not that it's coming from nowhere, that we make those claims, but that there is nothing in the world that says that whatever is floating past me that's fallen off the tree is a leaf. That's all on me, and that's all there's nothing in the world to say that the car is parked in the car park. There's nothing in the world to say that 2 + 2 = 4. It's all constructions that are necessary for me to comprehend and experience the world, and they're important for that experience, but they are not in the world. They're in me.
Well, thank you so much, Kristi. Thank you so much, Shaun. It's been fascinating. I feel like we need a part 2 to carry on, because there's been so much on it. But thanks so much for your questions as well. They were absolutely fantastic. It's been fascinating. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Have you got any questions that weren't answered in today's show? Maybe about truth? We'd love to hear from you. Where do you stand on the question of absolute truth? Please do send over your questions or your thoughts. Drop us a comment if you're watching on YouTube, tweet them to us on X @UnbelievableFE, or drop us a direct message on Instagram and Facebook @PremierUnbelievable. Your input is so important, and we do want to tackle all of your questions in upcoming shows. In the meantime, please be sure to check out our archive of past episodes available on YouTube, or your favourite podcast provider, or on our website, premierunbelievable.com. Thank you so much for joining us today, and see you next week.